Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guest from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Thank you, Arnie. Good to see you again. It's always a pleasure to get involved in these discussions. We hope that they are fruitful and that people find them to be of some value.
Hmm. I think what we're doing is actually vital, Robert. I think that our thinking, looking at the real world and looking at the environment we live in and this age of material plenty, I think that it's actually clear thinking that is going to work through the scenario that we find ourselves in. And I really appreciate your input. I'm sorry that we've got technical issues with Wally, but we have what we have, and I know that his input is always most welcome, and we'll just work our way through today's news forums. And there is plenty on there today, and there's actually some interesting articles that I'm going to bring up. The first one, Macola, and this paper in regard to vitamin D and the management of your health. I think it's so important. And this doctor here, Professor Roger Shaholt, medical doctor, he's actually got his input into it. And of course, the Macola gives him the environment, and I think that's so important. So I find Macola is a reliable source of valid medical information. The next one, natural news, and I see that there's Mike Adams is pre-warning the American people and also the rest of the world of the planned supply chain collapse. That this is not accidental, this is actually deliberate policy, and we'll work through who's actually controlling that policy later on. Joe Nova, again, the sea levels, climate, of course, climate propaganda. You're trying to piece together why they're persevering when it's obvious. We're 20 years into this climate fiasco and the sea levels haven't risen at all. Not appreciably, not at all. I think the Australian is just more or less sanitising everything for this bloke to re-elect him. All the photo opportunities, no criticism whatsoever. It doesn't look like we're going to have a federal election this year, but the media are right behind this bloke and they want to keep him in power because he's doing everything that their masters are asking of him. Financial review, there is talk about adjustments to mortgage, and I think that is seriously going to affect our young people new onto mortgage, heavily mortgaged, and even a slight change will actually cause a catastrophic domino effect across the housing market. Demonstrations around the place, and this is interesting that job seekers, people who are attempting to get jobs around Australia, their vaccine compliance is now a consideration. Demand for fully jabbed applicants rises, so more and more companies are actually asking for their employees, future aspiring employees, to be vaccinated, which is extraordinary. That your personal health is something that your company that you work for is going to recommend or decide or try and pressure you into accepting. Gateway pundit, still more things about the about COVID and about the election. Quite frustrating. Quite frustrating outcome. It doesn't seem to be making much headway through the courts with the election fraud. Now this one I thought was important. The theft of the global commons. I went to the root website of this Ian Davis, I think the bloke's name is, of his article, and he wrote the first part in October 12, but this second part, Seizing Everything, the Theft of the Global Commons, part 2, I think is really, really important that we start placing into context what is this COVID about, what is climate about, what does it actually mean, and why is it actually occurring? How do these things directly affect us? And in this article, The Theft of the Global Commons, Part 2, it has this illustration, and I want to bring it up because I think it's very important for us to consider. This is the structure. This is the structure of essentially what I would call world government. This is the structure of world government, and it's the influence of these World Economic Forums, the Council for Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome, Chatham House, the Rockefellers, and of course the different institutes that impose their philosophy over us. And of course, if you have a look at the policy enforcers, you realise that this is a deep state psyop, a deep psychological operation that's being exercised across the whole world. Very, very important. And in the course of, okay, you've got COVID, you've got a medical tyranny, you've got a lockdown, essentially a medical apartheid, and you've got climate and the threat of climate. So you tie in climate threat with CO2 and, of course, the Lima Declaration, and you realise that the industry from Western countries has been handed over predominantly to China, but more so to, or equally so, to third world nations. And of course, China still claims itself as a third world nation. So Australian industry, steel, shipyards, white goods, car manufacturing, all the ancillary industries that come from those primary industries is now over in China, or countries like claiming third world status like China. And we are doing none of these things. Now, this is our security. This is our self-reliance. This is our independence. And you look at that and you're thinking, these things don't occur accidentally. They occur as a course of policy. And that policy, of course, is reflected in that structure that I just showed you. Now, there is one more. I'm going to just cut across and I'll see if I can find it. We're going to go to our website, because this particular illustration was done in 1937, I'm pretty sure. 1937. Let's have a look. Actually, it might be under Actionist Corner. Better Declarations, Deutsche Bank, World Control. Let's have a look. No, that's Anthony. That's Douglas Reed. Okay, I'm going to go just to another website. Please bear with me. World Pyramid of Power. There it is. This Pyramid of Power. This was actually written in the New Age 1937. And if you compare the Pyramid of Power, that actual structure written in 1937, and then we go to this structure here, which is illustrated in 2021, you realise that those 85-year variation, it's still basically the same. And that is you've got central banking over the top. Central banking, and then you've got the world press, the platform and the pulpit, the justice. This is all United Nations areas, League of Nations, and then of course you've got the different national bodies and things like that. I'm actually working with another illustration while we're talking about this one, but that's the New Age. That's what we're actually looking at, is the New Age. 1937, this illustration. And I actually transposed this illustration, which was inside a printed document from 1937. And I don't know that I've got it readily available to show you, but it's essentially a mirror copy of this in their teletype. I think that's the best way to describe it. A mirror copy of that illustration going back from the New Age 1937, and there it is. It's there for you to consider. So the structure, the plan has been in place, what I can show you, for at least 85 years. But in actual fact, I believe this plan for world government, world control, goes back before the French Revolution. It's always been there. It even goes back to 1694, the Bank of England establishment, and before that to Cromwell. Why Cromwell? Why the revolution? Why the Dutch invasion? It was all part. This was all part of the if you like, the confiscation of the assets of Britain through the 1800s, 17th, 18th century, through the what they call the closing of the commons, and the seizing of that by the merchants in England. They seized it as their own. They had no right to it because, of course, it was commons. Everyone had access to the commons to grow their food, to run their cattle, to plant their trees and manage their orchards, all those sorts of things. And that land was seized by the, if you like, the merchants who controlled the parliament. So they did it through the law books. And of course, because they were able to get into Parliament and seize the power, this is the mechanism that they used. And it's no different today. The political parties, as a mechanism, have seized control of our parliaments, of our representation. They have seized control of it, the political parties have. And they are doing the bidding of these world powers. That's who they're representing. They've got nothing to do with the common people. And we need to understand that. We need to actually place those thoughts on the table for today's forum. Appreciate your comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, one thing that's missing, I think, from that graph you showed there, Arnie, is the immense development of non-governmental organizations and foundations and think tanks. These are huge, very, very seldom reported in the news, but they are working away all the time, and they are conditioning the thinking of politicians and through them, I guess, flowing down to the population. So people hold all sorts of ideas without having the foggiest notion of where they come from. But if you start to examine the connections of these organizations, it's an incredible web. There's no end to it. And you find crossovers and overlappings of personnel. It's a tremendous study if anyone wants to take it up. So these people are agents of primarily the financial institutions, and they have taken control of the public mind. There's a huge failure of education in our time, and that's why when this COVID crisis was declared, people didn't recognize immediately that it was just a coup. It's a political and economic coup, and I don't think that there is proper teaching of the history of politics involving coups, because there's a lot to be said and a lot to be understood on that subject. So it's really unfortunate that people have not been given the intellectual equipment to see the reality of what's going on. That is definitely the story behind the COVID crisis, and that is why it is being turned into a mechanism for dispossessing people throughout the world. The Great Reset. I've mentioned in the past that our Prime Minister in Canada, Trudeau, has commented on this, the Great Reset, build back better. The same slogan in every country practically throughout the world. I don't know if there are any exceptions, but even the great United States, the President of the United States is parroting the same slogan. We're going to build back better, but he's just a puppet. He's a pipsqueak in the power structure of the world. They always said he's the most powerful person in the world. Well, he's way down the scale now, and so this is an inability on the part of people to have a realistic take on what is happening in the world. And this has made them susceptible to the propaganda about the necessity for behaving themselves, for complying with all sorts of rules that have undermined constitutional protections everywhere. And it's, as I've said, it's a great failure of our educational system. But our educational system has been subverted. There's no doubt of this. This has been the plan for many, many years, that it would be directed, education would be directed more and more to emotional issues, to like racism or anti homosexuality, this sort of thing. This is what kids are taught in even in elementary school now, right through to the university years. You can get degrees in this area of study, and it's all just a distraction from uh, uh, real knowledge and real information, which has it not being conveyed to students. You know, if you studied the history, say, of the Bolshevik Revolution or the history of the Nazi, it wasn't a seizure of power. Hitler was actually elected in Germany, but subsequently he did many things that were revolutionary in order to uh, uh, firm up his control over that society. And the same with Mussolini. The same pattern was there. Mussolini was elected as well. He didn't have a violent takeover of the government, but still, if you study the history of these transformations, then you will recognize that what we're having in our society today is just it's built on the same model. We're experiencing an international coup, and that is definitely the way people should be perceiving it, instead of perceiving it as an effort on the part of their benevolent governments to save them from uh, a dreadful virus. I mean, this is just the external enemy. Every one of these coups, revolutions, has had to identify some kind of external enemy that they could organize against. They could take control of society and uh, convince the population that they had to go along with certain policies because there was an external threat to them. And this COVID has proven to be an ideal external threat, has it not? But just the uniformity of the language and the policies throughout the world is enough, surely, to indicate to people that this is a gigantic scheme. It's a plan. It's not uh, a happenstance or anything like that. And now that they say they're going to have their great reset and total dispossession of the population of the world, well, that should arouse people's suspicions, because that is the ultimate coup, isn't it? Stripping everybody of their property. And if you strip people of their property, you're stripping people of their freedom. So that's something that one hopes the population will come to realize before long.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for that, Robert. I want to touch on this image again because this is, I suppose, the most current perspective from Ian Davidson's point of view. And in it, you can see the mouse is the non-government organisations and the global corporations and, of course, the philanthropists. And this is the policy distributors, but the policy enforcers, we have a look at this. And you see the national governments, the civil service, the courts, the local government, statutory agencies. And so these are enforcing the policies, and then you have the propagandists and the hybrid war specialists. And that is very, very important to recognise that we are in a state of war. We are in a state of war, and of course the what was it, Sun Yat-sen, the art of war. He wrote in that the most important is counter information, is counterintelligence, is actually to make the enemy think certain things, and so on the basis of those things they could control what the enemy was actually doing. Counterintelligence, and that's what's going on with us. We think that we're doing something in response to something, but in actual fact, what we're doing is exactly what the world government hopes that we would do. We're caught up in this maze of misinformation, and it is actually tactics of war. in order to control us. And I was reading just the other day of how the British merchants were able to seize the commons. And part of it was that while they declared the property was their own, that was one, because of course they had control of Parliament. But the other was that if you actually have a tax imposed on you, and you think, well, okay, I've got an income, I can actually work that through, whatever. But what happens if you don't have an income? What happens if it gets to the stage, and don't tell me it's not heading there, get to the stage where there actually money in circulation continues to be shortened? Shortened to the point where people are actually wrestling over getting access to the printed notes and coins in order to pay their taxes. When it gets to that point, they can't pay their taxes because there's a shortening of the money supply. And on the basis of that shortening, you can't pay your taxes, and that's where the government, in actual fact you could say the merchants, then seize your assets, seize your property, because there is no. Now, we've got to look at supply chain collapse. We've got to look at the exorbitant increases in the costs of fuel and energy, and the fact that we do not have a self-reliant nation. Now, when Australia came out of the Second World War, we had all of these things that we needed. We had primary industry, steel, shipyards. We even had our own aircraft manufacturing. One of the social creditors on this show reminded me that a plane that he flies in New Zealand was actually made in Australia. A plane. We actually had our own aircraft manufacturing industry in Australia when we came out of the war, and that went on for a while afterwards. We were a self-reliant people. We were independent. We were actually considered loyalty to our own nation, our own kith and kin. All these things have been deconstructed. Our culture, our significant cultural achievements. Now, you think about it. Australia, 1788, 250 years ago, 235 years ago, whatever, was a barren continent. There were no highways. There was no power generation. There was no sewer and water systems. There was no gas. There was no farms and fences and everything else. There was nothing. It was just Australia and the indigenous Aboriginal who was a hunter-gatherer. That's what he was, a hunter-gatherer. And as I understand it, in Tasmania, the Aboriginal had regressed to the point where even the if you like, the comforts, the creature comforts that the mainland Aboriginal had, they did not experience the same in Tasmania. So very, very important to recognise that Australia was not uninhabited. It was inhabited, but it certainly wasn't. It wasn't actually part of a, if you like, a structure, a civil structure, in a sense that we understand it as a central government and things like that, or as state governments or whatever. They were just tribes, and they would move about and follow the food, and that's how they survived. And of course, if the food was scarce, then of course there were hard decisions made. That's the nature of Australia 250 years ago. But Australia today, we look at highways, we look at byways, we look at ships, we look at ports, we look at infrastructure, we look at buildings, homes, all these sorts of things, the exploitation of the natural resources, all these things. Australia is an entirely different nation, and it has, and this is actually something to be proud of. When the First Fleet arrived in Australia, they brought 1,000, 2,000 years of cultural development with them in the common law. The common law came with the First Fleet. And I remind our viewers that one of the first court cases we had in Australia was a convict challenging the captain of the boat over the loss of some cargo. And the convict won the case, that the captain was responsible. So the common law held valid from day one in Australia, and I think that's really, really important. We didn't come with nothing. We came with a rich cultural inheritance, and of course that cultural inheritance included the Industrial Revolution. It included the common law, the development of parliaments, Westminster system of parliaments, and also what it also came with was the Christian religion. And that Christian religion was fundamental to their philosophy. It was fundamental to their infrastructure, to their institutions. It was fundamental. It was actually the grounding of those institutions. Our parliament, when we finally settled upon a model of federation, we settled upon it, it was Trinitarian by nature. These things are part of our rich cultural inheritance. That's what Christianity is. It's Trinitarian by nature, by its very, very core, its very fabric. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's permeated within everything in creation. Trinitarianism is permeated. So this is what we actually inherited when we came to Australia. And that's part of our cultural inheritance that is worth recognising and holding on to. Now when we look at the situation that we're in today, when we look at it, we look at this absolute power being exercised by world government over the individual. We see that this is actually in conflict. It's in conflict with this philosophy. It's in conflict with the principles of service, of public service, of decentralised government, of limited constitutional government. This policy that we're seeing is actually in conflict. And that conflict is essentially, if you described it in one sentence, you would say that power emanates outside of the individual. Power actually is exercised by this family of 300, this world government, the World Economic Forum and the Council for Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome and all that. Power emanates from them. Whereas the Christian philosophy says this is not so. It says that power originates within. The kingdom of God is within. It's a free gift. Your freedom is a gift from God. It's not from the Council for Foreign Relations or the Club of Rome. This is why philosophy is so important. It's why you bind things back. What do you ultimately believe? Is God or is not God? Council for Foreign Relations believes that the highest order of being is man himself. And that's how they're expressing it, that these elite men, women, are to rule the world because they are elite. Whereas the Christian philosophy presents the case that no, God is God, and only God is God, and he is a jealous God. And in that all creation exists because God is. Jesus made the claim when he said to the Sanhedrin, I am. That is the name of God. I am. I exist. And we exist because of God. And when we look at the world around us, this is the challenge for us. We've turned away. We've turned away. We think this is not important. It is so, so important. It's so important because it's where you actually place your root. It's where you place your cap. This is what I think, and this is what I do. And Australia, when it brought this Christian faith with it, with the First Fleet, when it brought it, it's actually lost sight of it. And now it's taken up, what would you call it? I would call it foreign gods. Strange and foreign gods. Demons in the forest that frighten us. Whereas Christianity teaches you about a God of love, loved you so much, enough to come and have a personal visitation in the form of the Christ. And then on the basis of that, willingly suffered, even death, to demonstrate that great and wonderful love. That's the Christian faith. And to me, it's a message of hope. Because in that are the keys to unlocking the tyranny. The keys are within Scripture. They're in the words of Christ, in the words of Christ in red, emboldened there. There are the keys. There is the understanding. There is the truth of how to deconstruct this narrative and decipher the lies from the truth. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, another concept that Christianity brought with it was that the greatest role that a human can perform is to be a servant. And this is definitely not the thinking of the people who are striving to capture power today. It's just a power game. They're not thinking of serving their fellow man in any way. And of course, the ultimate model for serving their fellow man was Jesus, who sacrificed his own life to show us the way that we should be thinking and behaving ourselves. So, this notion of service was even recognized in the administration of government, because the term for the bureaucracy in common law countries was generally, I think, public service. It's certainly that way in Canada, public service. And when uh, people in this bureaucracy used to write to the public, they would say, "Your humble servant," often. That's gone out of fashion now. Now they would say, "Your future uh, future boss," I guess, or something like that, because that's the mentality they have. The idea that they are performing a service to society has completely gone by the boards. I'm sure that in public administration courses that idea is not taught, because modern bureaucracies are conditioned to think in terms of telling people what to do. They've got this enormous number of statutory instruments, regulations, tens upon tens of thousands of them. And the bureaucracy is told that their job is to make sure that these are applied. They're not trying to help people out. I mean, there are lots of well-disposed individuals in these bureaucracies, but the overall policy of the bureaucracy is to make sure that people are complying with orders, and that's the way they think. The bureaucracies are very inventive when it comes to producing pretexts for uh, getting people to do what they want them to do, and to even strip people of what those people assume to be their constitutional rights. Very inventive, and we've seen this now with the COVID thing. You have no more freedom of motion, of movement, uh, that is assured. You don't have freedom of speech. Uh, all the traditional rights that we have assumed we had have been undermined by this. It's a uh, bureaucratic coup. Uh, the 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 uh, the administrators in a communist government are apparatchiks. They are just people who are imposing on the population the decisions that are made by a tiny group at the top of society. But that is completely at odds with the traditional view of administration that we've had in our societies. It would be very important, I think, for the old concept to be revived. Of course, it won't be unless people understand what it was, and there's no effort to educate them along these lines. So much has been lost, and it's a great tragedy. And there should be a concentrated effort to recover the best of what was in in our previous societies. I mean, we are in the strangest position now. Practically every government meeting, or even uh, radio broadcast, ends with a declaration that it's being done on native land. I think you have the same phenomenon in Australia, but it seems to me that it is a concession that the population of Canada that has come, I guess, as immigrants hundreds of years ago, has no legitimate rights to assume that uh, they control anything in the country, because we're here on sufferance. We're here on sufferance because we are on somebody else's land. It's a more revolutionary concept could not be imagined, and I really think that the natives are being used for a revolutionary purpose. I'm sure that some of them are receiving uh, subsidies in order to assert uh, uh, these claims, and they are, I think, probably a great minority in the native community. I think, generally speaking, the natives are quite happy to be living in the uh, with the advantages that the European society brought to them. And if there was a, a genuine attempt to ascertain their thinking on this subject, they would probably say, well, as long as we are participating in the wealth of this amazing society that we have, the society of abundance, then frankly, we're not worried about claiming our treaty rights or our property rights. They are sort of irrelevant, because we can have a good, prosperous life as long as we have our share in the productivity of society. So uh, there's an attempt to make the uh, minorities in countries think that they have been victimized all along. I was listening to a broadcast from the United States today. I don't know if you know this fellow Buttigieg. He's the Secretary of Transport for the United States in the Biden administration. And you know, the supply system is breaking down in a serious way in the United States. You know what his major policy goal is right now? It's not to make the uh, the goods move. It's to reconfigure the highway system, which he says is the product of institutional racism. The highway system is an expression of institutional racism. So you can see the insanity that this kind of thinking has led us to. It's dividing society. It's breaking, hiving groups off and making them feel alienated, always with the promise that if they can assert this alienation, then they're going to get some sort of financial reward for it. In Canada right now, there's a big uh, to do. I mean, it should be a to do if it's true, but they allege that they've found about 1,000 graves of school children who were in the residential school system, which was a system that the government established to bring Native kids so that they would get an education that made them fit better into the prevailing society of the time. Now, the story that's being brooded about is that these kids were actually murdered, and they've got these 1,000 uh, uh, graves allegedly, and we have had our flags flying at half mast, I think, for about 3 months, and it's all in recognition of our great national guilt. Trudeau is an expert at trying to instill shame and guilt in the population. And he's the one who has ordered this flying of the flags at half mast. Well, it's a very strange thing, because for months now, nothing has been done to verify whether these graves, which have been detected with ground penetrating radar, and ground penetrating radar gives very vague indications of what's under the soil, I'll tell you that. I've seen examples of it. It's not as if you're taking a picture of a body under the ground. There'll be a slight disturbance of the soil. And on the basis of this, they're alleging that all these bodies are buried there. Well, if that's the case, surely there's a crime. Surely there should be an investigation. Surely the police should be in there. They should be exhuming the bodies. They should be trying to ascertain who they are. They should be trying to ascertain if they have been the victims of murder or something maybe less serious. Who is responsible for that? They're not doing that. It's just as far as I'm concerned, it's another con job. It's a con job along the lines of this COVID crisis. Nothing that we are told is a major event is real. And this applies even to the international politics. We're told that the Chinese are doing such and such. We're told the Russians are doing such and such. It's all invention, and it's designed to instill fear and insecurity in the population so that they will conform to the dictates of the government. It's the oldest game in politics. It's being played, and we've seen now the prime example of it with uh, the threat of a deadly virus that is going to kill huge numbers, huge swathes of the population, which it's not doing. But it's psychological manipulation, and this is what modern governments have refined and perfected and are applying against their populations.
Thank you, Robert, for that. I want to actually cut across to our websites because I think there's some documents of interest that may assist our audience. The first is the Art of War over here in the Actionist corner on the right-hand side at the top. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And if you want even further, there's the Complete Art of War under other interesting documents. The Complete Art of War. Antecedents of Communism is there as well. Grand Orient Freemasonry Unmasked, and of course the Protocols. This helps you understand at least that there are records for you to go through to have an actual look. But there's also videos. Jeff McDonald. Jeff McDonald was a former member of the Communist Party of Australia, and he chose to walk away from it because he was not satisfied that this is where he wanted to be and spend the rest of his life endorsing. And so what he did was he went and met up with Eric Butler, one of the original founders of the Australian League of Rights, and spoke to Eric, and he gave him his complete understanding of what was actually going on within the Communist Party, and in particular the Aboriginal land rights movement. Jeff McDonald was tied in with the union movement associated with Aboriginal land rights, and so he had first-hand experience. Now, what he did was he produced this book, Red Over Black, and on our BitChute video channel, you'll have a 1-hour video of Jeff McDonald actually speaking to you and showing you what he knew, what he understood was actually going on within the land rights movement and the Aboriginals, if you like, being subverted, being tools, being pawns. And of course the counter came back, oh, this is all baloney, how can you prove it? Well, the second book, this is the Red Over Black book link here in Veritas Books, but the second book is the evidence. And Jeff McDonald makes the point of providing the evidence of his accusations against the Communist Party of Australia and its permeation within the land rights movement and what it was all about. And of course what it is all about is about world government. That's what it's about. We've had people like Jeff McDonald blow the whistle on what was going on. We've had the Whittaker Chambers. We've had Soviet defectors showing us, explaining. We've had Soviet dissidents, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, warning the West again and again and again. Yuri Bezhnikov, I think, or something like that. We've got his books in our library. There are all those who are warning, who have warned us that this was coming, and now it's coming. And the preparation, if you like, I'm reminded that the preparation, we've had more than 20 years of terror. The War on Terror, 2000, the Twin Towers with the actual controlled demolition of three towers, three multi-story buildings, ground zero. Three multi-story buildings collapsed that day, pulverized into dust. Concrete and steel pulverized into dust in mid-air. I mean, you have a look at that footage again, and then have a look at controlled demolitions, and you realise, hang on a sec, we were patsies. This was a con job, and it was a con job. It was a con. It was a justification for expansionist policies for the American administration to essentially open up a new world war. But in that war on terror, that was actually laying the groundwork. The fear was Islam. The fear was terrorists. Was all of these things that were going on in the Middle East. But in actual fact, the fear was unfounded from their point of view. It was actually coming from the administrations of the West, the think tanks of the West. This was all part of a bigger plan, a bigger policy, and that was for us to have imposed on us essentially a war footing. And then from that war footing, we've continued on with greater and greater restrictions. All the civil defence acts that went through America, and then now to the point where we've got medical acts imposing the same type of martial law over people. That's what we're experiencing. The groundwork, the actual laying the groundwork for this has been going on for a long, long time. Jeff McDonald goes back last century, I think to around the 80s, even the 70s. But Whittaker Chambers was well before that. Alga Hiss, the establishment of the United Nations. These building blocks are all part of this infrastructure that we're seeing outworking now. These plans have been going on for a long, long time, since before the French Revolution, to bring about world government. And you think, well, how do you even start to make sense of it? How do you actually start to decipher it? And to me, the key to it is to actually start looking at okay, if these things have transpired, who's behind it? Who is behind it? Who is behind these think tanks that actually bring these things about, that actually impose? Who is behind Soros? I mean, where does he get his squillions from that he can be involved in every pop-up political movement around our nation, but every other nation? Where does he get his squillions from? It obviously he's financed. Someone has got to do it, and then you realise that, of course, if there's an unending supply of money, then you realise that, of course, the money power. This is where it comes from. Central banking, Bank of International Settlements, the same merchants that invaded England, the same hidden hand, if you like, that was behind the revolution, Oliver Cromwell, that brought about the chopping off the head of Charles I and of course the driving out of, I think it was James II, to impose William of Orange, a Dutchman, as if you like the monarch over that nation. And why England? Why? Because at that time the central bank had already been established in Holland, and they needed to establish a central bank in the heart of the Empire of Britain, which of course was a world power at that time. So they established it in the if you like, the square mile of London, which is almost like a sovereign nation in itself. And of course, if you consider that when the Queen, the monarch, enters the square mile of London to be greeted by the Lord Mayor of the square mile of London, the monarch bows. And that to me is very important. You recognise a monarch bows, a world leader bows, the leader of the, if you like, the free world, the British Commonwealth bows. Yes, the monarch bows to the square mile of London. So very, very important. This to me is the seat of power over the empire. And of course you had the same, if you like, the same establishment of central banking with the creature from Jekyll Island. I came across a website just the other day, and it was interesting. It was to do with the story, the history of usury. I'm going to cut across. I'm going to drive it so you can actually watch it with me. It was to do with the story of usury, and it goes through. I'll pick it up here because it's in our latest on target, which you will find on the website. Um, the story of usury for budding historians, and I put the link in here so I know where it is. Um, and what it does is it shows you. There it is. There. It gives you, and I'll bring it up. I'll open it up. So please excuse the delay, but I think it's worthwhile. Command copy, and we'll just post it up here. What this person has done, this historian has done, is they have actually chronologically worked through, he did it in 2006, Andrew Hitchcock, worked through what the money changers have been doing for several thousand years, and how even the event of Christ driving the money changers out of the temple, that was a symbolic gesture that had a profound truth in it. Now, 1913 was the establishment of the Reserve Bank of America, creature from Jekyll Island, and of course all of the names and everything that goes with it. But what I found interesting was that the sources that this man has used are at the bottom of this article. And I think that that in itself is really, really important, in that it is a long-term strategy, a strategy that has been going on for world power for several thousand years. The usurers are trying to take over the world, and this is their final stanza. Britain itself, in the time of Oliver Cromwell, Britain itself was dominated by the British East Indies Company. The actual expansion into the free world was generally to the benefit of the East Indies Company, and of course the Dutch East Indies was another part of that. These international corporations that actually operate over and above national governments. And so you had the British East Indies Company, the Dutch East Indies Company, and if you want to know who went up the rivers in China to impose the opium on the Chinese people, it was both the Dutch and the British East Indies Companies with their gunboat diplomacy. That's where it came from. They went up the Yangtze River and Yangtze River or whatever, and they opened up on the villages and the towns until the Chinese yielded to break the resolve of their people. And that's exactly what we're experiencing. We are being colonized by these world powers, these powers over and above government, and it's gone on for thousands of years. So that particular website, I really appreciate what that researcher has produced, and of course quite a few of those books. None dare call it conspiracy, tragedy and hope, and the creature from Jekyll Island. I think at least 3 of those books we hold in PDF form in our library, so you don't even need to buy them. You can actually go to there, have a look and read them, and some of them are quite some works. Carol Quigley, quite a significant work. It's about 3 inches thick, that book. So this is the research that is necessary in order to start unraveling what's going on. It's not a quick fix. I don't believe we've got a quick fix on this situation. They have taken over our governments. They've certainly taken over our media. They have complete control of our media. They've taken over our governments. They have control of our political institutions, our bureaucracy, and our political parties. We are in dire straits. We are being colonised into a world, if you like, a world conglomeration controlled by international corporations, which are really ultimately controlled by a family of 300 through the Bank of International Settlements. These usurers, which is this craft of creating money out of nothing. Very, very important, because this to me is the environment that we live in. And unless we start to actually understand it, how can we decipher it? How can we actually start to deconstruct it? How could we actually suppose that we can actually get control of our bureaucracy back to the point where we may call them public servants instead of public masters? It really is such a lot to undo, and I couldn't recommend more. Than to actually go to our website and start doing some of the courses. And I'll bring up the website itself and I'll show you why is it important to do some training. Why is it important? The most important training you can do, I think, to start off with, is social dynamics. Social dynamics is essentially the way people come together, why they form societies, why do they form societies, and under what basis do they form societies. Unless you can appreciate that there has to be an undergirding philosophy. There has to be. And if you're going to have a society coming together, why do you want it to come together? Surely it's for mutual benefit. Surely it's for mutual cooperation. It's actually an act of love between peoples, whether it's just yourself and your neighbour. It's an act of love. And of course, with the social dynamics comes the real credit and the potential credit, the financial credit and the real credit, if you like, of a community. What is the real credit? It's the assets, it's the know-how, it's the raw materials, it's the resources available. That's your real credit. Whereas financial credit, the usurer's craft would take all of that away from you. And this is what we're actually experiencing with that article that I came up before, which was essentially the usurer's craft, and of course the plan to strip the assets of the entire world unto themselves. This is the usurer's craft. The usurer, Joseph, with his coat of many colours. He was an economist, and he used the financial system to exploit to the point where they lost all of their assets. They lost their farms, they lost their cattle, they lost all of their assets completely, to the point where they sold themselves into slavery. That was Joseph. That was the usurer, using that craft. No different. The closing of the commons, 1600s, 1700s, the closing of the commons. And then, of course, the shortening of the supply of money. So people couldn't pay their taxes. They couldn't pay it with kind. And of course, it was insisted that they pay it with the coinage of the land. So if they shorten the money, then the money becomes extraordinarily difficult to get your hands on. So you can't pay your taxes. So you have your assets confiscated. This is what the Club of Rome has got planned for you. This is what the World Economic Forum is planning for you. It's to the point where you can't pay your bills, the point where you can't pay your taxes. And so your assets will be stripped, every single thing, because they're manipulating the financial system. This usurer's craft goes back thousands of years, and that's why that website is so important. If you don't understand these things, then you can't even begin to unravel what is going on. You can't discern what is going on in order to actually start to place together, well, how do we start to rebuild to the point where we can actually review our own agreement, what we call our constitution, the agreement of the people. How will we be governed? How will we be governed? This is the question that's being asked of this age. Will it be that power is outside of us and it belongs to those who control the Club of Rome? Is that how we're going to be governed? Is that what we accept as the ultimate reality? Or is it that the kingdom of God is within, that we will be governed by ourselves, and that we have a mechanism? It's a broken mechanism, but we have a mechanism, and it's called limited government, limited constitution. It's called parliament, it's called representatives, it's called the vote. These things all come into it. And ultimately, of course, and this is the genius of Douglas, and that is that with a mechanism, an economic vote he called the national dividend, gives you the opportunity of actually having your share of our cultural inheritance in this age of plenty, in this age of abundance, of robotics, automation, advanced control, industrialization, massive energy sources. We've got all of these things at our fingertips, and we're losing control of it because these group of 300, if you like, claim the whole assets of the world as their own. And they would have control of it, and they are actually, what are they doing? They are confiscating, they are filching what actually rightfully belongs to you as part of your cultural inheritance. Industry manufactures for the whole world. China is manufacturing basically for the whole world. If one central point can manufacture everything, agriculture for instance, 5% of the population or even 3% can manufacture all that you need, then surely you have a claim on the produce. Not the land, not the machinery, not the resources, but the produce, a claim. A claim that says, what is the purpose of producing all that food? It's so that people can enjoy it, they can consume it, they can eat it. It's your claim. The purpose of production is consumption. Beautiful words, most profound. And this is why social dynamics, this is why learning, this is why studying, this is why renewing of your mind is so very important. Without that, I don't believe there is a quick fix for this. We will go into a dark ages because we chose not to rise up and insist on our freedoms and insist on our inheritance. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert.
Well, the financial system is what controls initiative in society. The financial system is a manufacturer of credit, financial credit. It creates it out of nothing. It loans it it loans it out to the community, and the community has an obligation to repay it. So this obligation to repay it is something that means that the attainment of genuine freedom is virtually impossible, because the financial credit is always flowing back to the banking system. And if they reduce the outward flow, then people are going to be deficient in the money they need in order to live their lives. So this is a dictatorship and a system of control. You know, I listen to these survivalists, these people who say, well, when the system collapses, I'm just going to go out and shoot a deer or something. Well, the trouble is that the bureaucracy is going to be after these people to make monetary payments of some kind. And there's no way really to escape this. If you own a house, if you own land, you've got property taxes to pay. No matter what you do, you end up having to make financial payments in the society we're in. Now, the problem with this is that the finance is controlled out of a center. The finance, the power of that finance should be decentralized. It should be in the hands of the population. If we have a democracy, then that means rule by the people. I'm telling you, we don't have a democracy in our financial system. We've got a dictatorship. So that is where the focus of people's attention ultimately must be. This is the greatest issue that the public can deal with. There are all sorts of ancillary things, you know, but if you're going to strike at the roots of our problem, we're going to have to reform and reconfigure our financial system. And as Arnie, you mentioned C.H. Douglas, he's the one who gave the sanest guidelines for doing this in such a way that it will actually distribute power to all citizens, which surely should be the purpose of an association, of a society such as we live in. It's not being done now. And so the national dividend is the mechanism whereby this could be done. And it is a completely novel way of thinking of the distribution of power in society. But once you apply your mind to it, you realize that it's the only sane perspective you can have on monetary and financial policy. So people really would do well to look into Douglas's writings and give consideration to what he was proposing. There's just one other point I wanted to make tonight, and that is the sort of casual attitude that people are taking to, they've taken to all these COVID restrictions, the masking and social distancing and all this silliness, but to the issue of a vaccination being mandated for the population. This is the most dangerous thing you could possibly imagine. It is a uh, it is a precedent that will affect our future in the most dire ways, because essentially what people have done in accepting this vaccination program, especially the mandatory aspects of it, and I mean, the governments are alleging it's not mandatory, but if they take away all your rights to have a normal life, if you don't get it, I would say that's the very definition of mandatory myself. They've changed all the definitions of words in order to pursue their policies in this regard. But the people who are getting this vaccine are surrendering to the government their uh, autonomy, their authority to decide what they're going to do with their bodies. And once this principle that the government can order you to take a vaccine is established, there will be no going back from it. And the government will be finding pretexts and excuses to be telling you to be taking all kinds of medications in future. And we know for a fact that the governments today are virtually dictated to by the pharmaceutical industry. These drug companies have become so enormous and so well financed, so rich, that they are able to buy politicians and to control advertising even in the most sophisticated and authoritative medical journals. It's an astonishing thing. You see advertisements for drug companies in these journals. So this means that the journals are dependent on the pharmaceutical companies for their survival. Are they going to be critical in an objective way of these pharmaceutical companies if they're dependent on their financing in order to continue their operations? Not very likely. That's just not realistic. It's not the way the world works. So people really should think deeply about what the implications of this vaccine program are, because governments do not surrender powers once they've acquired them. That would be a very unusual event. And once they have established this precedent of being able to tell you what you have to take into your body for the pretext of dealing with some health issue, it will never stop. Already it's shaping up that people are going to be taking boosters for the rest of their lives once they've embarked on this vaccination program, because the vaccines don't seem to be effective, if they are effective, for more than a matter of a few months. So it's going to be a system of enslavement such as the world has never seen before. And everybody's health is going to be under the control of bureaucrats. I can't imagine that straight thinking people would want that to happen, but that is definitely the path that we are on now. And if this vaccination gambit is not stopped, there's going to be no end of it. And it's going to lead to a very dreadful future for mankind, for your kids, for your grandkids. They're going to be told what medical substances they should be taking into their bodies. Think about that. They won't have any discretion over that on their own. It'll be dictated to them. And There was a time when people were suspicious of politicians. There was a time when politicians were regarded as, generally speaking, pretty devious and self-serving individuals. For some reason now, that's all gone, and we're just supposed to obey whatever the politicians tell us we ought to do. Well, I think that the old farmer who was dealing with something real had a pretty good assessment of the politicians who were dealing with theoretical considerations. The farmer was rooted in reality, and the politician was rooted in theory and ambition. And the farmer had a pretty good estimate of uh, where the politician should sit vis-a-vis vis-a-vis himself. If we're going to assume that politicians are always telling us the truth and always looking out for our best interests, we are going to be living in a completely deluded world. And let's hope that we can get back to the old circumspection when it came to believing the words issuing from the mouths of any person who was purporting to be doing us favors out of positions of power and making a very comfortable and well endowed life out of their dictating to us in this way. You've got to be suspicious when people are benefiting from the proceeds of power in the way that politicians are. Their interests, why would their interests be your welfare? It just doesn't make sense that would be their primary concern. So bear that in mind when you're considering what this vaccination program means for the future.
Well said, Robert. I had other thoughts and you crossed them off the list as I was thinking them. So I think you've done particularly well with the summary. I really, really appreciate it. Just once more, I'll just touch on our website, if you bear with me, ladies and gentlemen, because I think it's important, the resources that are there for you. Our homepage brings you the very important work of Dr. Judy Weilerman, her 3 lectures from our national weekend, and a video or podcast. There's these 3 videos. This middle one from Sidney Powell, the American solicitor, in regard to the systemic fraud in the American elections, and of course the warnings of the warning of Queensland last December, Queensland elections, those Chinese coders who were controlling everything for the Queensland Electoral Commission, and of course that's the actual recording of the electoral outcome of Queensland, and that 4-hour video, and of which I found some extraordinary anomalies where there appears to be direct influence over the software. Our video broadcasts each week go up here, and the latest, which will be 44, this one will be placed up tomorrow. This one we're doing now is 45. And of course the on target that corresponds with the video. I actually extract some of my information for the on target from the video, and then I continue on my research. But most important are the libraries, probably the most important for the website. Douglas is found here under the Social Credit Library, a very, very comprehensive resource. If you know of any books that Douglas has been involved in, any speeches or anything like that you think I should have up, send them to me, and I'll certainly make sure that they're available for anyone and everyone in PDF form. And of course there's a backup with the not directly involved with Douglas Social Credit, but certainly involved in the world of freedom, and that's where the PDF library is about. And of course there's enormous resources that are in there, and I've tailored the Actionist corner in regard to training. That to me is the key to the resources, is the social credit training. This is from social credit writers for the last over 100 years. Tudor Jones was the writer of the actual diploma that goes with the social credit learning. So it really is from the very beginning of social dynamics through the works of Betty Luks here, of Eric Butler there, further with Eric Butler in this area, and then finally Tudor Jones. This is all part of the training that's available at your leisure to work these things through. And I think these are actually wonderful resources. They certainly have helped me understand social credit and my thinking, and trying to actually place myself in the world around and to decipher the events of the day. It's not easy. It is not easy because the level of subterfuge is so great. The level of propaganda, misinformation, and straight out censorship. It is not easy to actually extract the truth from this situation, but it is there for those that pursue it. And I'll continue to support anyone else's research. If they're happy to use their website, go right ahead, copy it, do whatever you like with it. It's there as a tool, and that's what it's about. So I hope that today has been helpful. I hope that it's actually informed you. It's deciphered the news and events a little bit further, and it's helped you orientate your thinking so that you can actually place your thoughts on the table and start deciphering what's going on, and then assessing what strategies you think you need to put into place to bring about a better world, an opportunity for freedom rather than tyranny. Thank you so much for today, Robert. I always appreciate your involvement, your input. There's a lot of deep thinking there, and I think you and Wally and the others who participate in this are actually jewels in the crown of today's social creditors. So thank you so much.
Thank you, honey.
Cheers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Cheers.